Hello, class. I'm in my office, as you can see, and I'm going to record the fourth nervous system lecture. Let's do it. Let's see. So in this one, we're going to continue down the, talk about the parts of the brain. So I've already talked about the cerebrum, the lobes of that, and their functions. And now we'll get down to further deeper in the brain, to the diencephalon and the brainstem. But first, let's talk about a common cause of death and disability, which are strokes. And they're often called CVAs, or cerebral vascular accident. So something's going wrong in your brain with the blood supply. And your brain tissue is very hungry for glucose and oxygen. And if it's starved, you can see here, even for a short amount of time, it causes damage. And after a few hours, it's irreversible. So the biggest, most important thing if a person is having a stroke is how rapid you get them to the hospital, and how they can clear that up, because the time is ticking, and if you wait too long, that part of the brain that is starved of blood will die irreversibly. So we'll talk about two different kinds of strokes, but they're mostly, if you look at the risk factors, of course, is old age. As you get older, you're more likely to have a stroke. And high blood pressure is big. We'll see, it can cause blood vessels to burst. An aneurysm is when a blood vessel balloons out, that can burst to cause massive bleeding in the brain. You can see previous strokes, diabetes, smoking, high cholesterol, all these things will contribute to a stroke. Or if you have clots that are thrown from your heart or elsewhere, they can lodge in vessels in your brain. So risks for clotting. And this US deaths, actually, I tried to do some research here. It's really hard to get concrete numbers, but COVID-19 is gone up there in terms of causing human deaths. But you can see stroke is up among the top causes of death, along with heart disease and cancer. So the two kinds of strokes are either going to be ischemic or hemorrhagic. And the hemorrhaging is going to be bleed. It's going to be a bleed. And that's usually, like I say, remember, an aneurysm is a ballooning out of the artery if that bursts. But any kind of weakness in the artery, and again, high blood pressure is going to really test the system. Any kind of weakness, you could have a burst. And that's bleeding in the brain. And thus, with the blood pouring out of a vessel, the part of the artery that was, part of the brain that was served by that artery is going to no longer have blood in it. The other one is more common is ischemic. You can see 87%. And that is, ischemia is when you have a lack of blood flow to an area, and it's caused by a clot. It's usually a blood clot, but it can be a piece of fat. A thrombus is a clot that travels around your body. An embolus, I'm sorry, an embolus is a thrombus is a clot, and an embolus is when it breaks off from somewhere else. You could take a long plane ride, clots can form behind your knee, and then later those can lodge in your lung or lodge in some of your cerebral arteries. So ischemic is the most common, and that's where a clot is going to block off an artery, thus depriving that part of the brain of blood. And the other one is a bleed, which, as you can see, is rare. Both of them have the same effect. Part of the brain dies, and so the effects can be widespread. They can be minor, or they can be a cause of death. But even if you survive a stroke, as you can see, 75% of stroke survivors still have long-lasting effects, disabilities, mental, emotional, or physical. Sometimes you'll see a stroke on one side of the brain can cause paralysis, on the opposite side. So you can see the effects. And so all of you should be aware of some warning signs of the stroke. You can see this, act fast. Yeah. So you'll often see, and the person might not even notice it, but their speech will be slurred. It's like, well, are you having a stroke? Yes. I mean, if that's one effect of that. Half of the body or half of the face will be weak or numb, because it's affecting half of the brain, and that's going to affect the other half, definitely. And again, time is of the essence. If you get to the hospital and it's a ischemic, as a clot, they can give you clot busting drugs, get rid of it, or do surgery to remove that clot. It can restore the blood flow. But if you have a stroke by yourself and you're not discovered for hours, then that part of the brain will die. Another thing is, of course, concussions. And a lot of you are in sports. I know this. And concussion is a type of a minor traumatic brain injury. It's the MTBI. And obviously, a major traumatic brain injury could be after you have an explosion near you, or a bad car accident. But concussion, obviously, I think you all know, is from a blow to the head. And usually they are just short acting, a few days, headaches, nausea, and days of rest. When you rest your brain, it's going to recover. But again, you guys in sports, are well aware that multiple concussions. And they looked at college football players. They put sensors in the helmet, and they say in a season 950 hits to the head on average. So these things can add up. So boxers and football players, they get multiple concussions. And all of you know the concussion rules. If you get multiple concussions, you're out, right? A concussion, you can come back. But if you keep getting them, it's just too much risk to some permanent damage. Indeed. I just want you guys to take a look at this. Yeah, you have pupils are different sizes. So that's definitely a sign that something's going on in the brain. All right. So strokes, concussions, big things. And those strokes, you can have mini strokes too, that can come and go. Let's say you get a clot that partially occludes, and you can have some slurring and some one-sided effects, and then it can go away. But then you definitely want to go to the hospital, and they can do an angiogram, and because you could be a ticking time bomb for a full-on stroke. So mini strokes, you probably heard of those. All right, let's get into the brain. So the cerebrum, covers all the rest of this brain. And then as you go in is the diencephalon I'm showing here. So it's part of the forebrain in development. Cerebrum is the biggest piece, but then the diencephalon's deep in there. And if you think of this diencephalon in there, it's actually the third ventricle is the middle of it. That's the space filled with water, the third ventricle. And the walls are called the thalamus. Imagine you're standing in the third ventricle. The walls are bulging in on you. That's the thalamus. The roof is going to be the epithalamus. And the floor you're standing on is the hypothalamus. And if you look behind you, the hypothalamus, there's a hole in the floor back there. And that's going to be that cerebral aqueduct goes down to that fourth ventricle. So there's this hole where water is draining down. And there's actually holes above you where water is draining in from those big lateral ventricles. So that helps you right in the middle of the brain. You're standing in the third ventricle. And again, thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. And then there's holes from the first two ventricles coming down and a hole in the back. And if you look behind you, there's a pine cone kind of on the roof there. That's your pineal gland that I'll get to next. Yeah. And so this diencephalon obviously has a central location. It's going to be a big switching center. Everything coming into the cerebrum and leaving the cerebrum is going to go through that. And when you think hypothalamus, you think all kinds of things for homeostasis. It's your center for thirst and hunger, temperature, all these things. The hypothalamus is critical. And the hypothalamus makes all these releasing hormones that are going to release hormones from your pituitary gland that we'll talk about. So hypothalamus, when we talk about all kinds of things related to hormones and regulation of life, it's centered in that lower part of the thalamus. All right, taking a look here. I don't know, let's see here. We can, no, we don't want that. Oops. Where's my screen sharing? Yeah, we'll come back to here. But look at in the middle there, you see that purple thing in the back. That's going to be your pineal gland. What does that gland do? And then you look up more anterior, you see your pituitary gland hangs down below. And And that gland, both of these glands we'll talk about next semester when we do the endocrine system or your hormone system. Well, that pineal gland is sometimes called the third eye. And believe it or not, the light from your eyes is going to go to the pineal gland, and it's going to measure day length, when sunrise and sunset is. And it's very important for the biological clock of the deer I'm looking for out there. They see with the shortening day length that it's time to breed, because the does want to be bred, well, evolutionarily want to be bred about 200 days from when they want the fawns. That's their gestation. And so you want your fawns not to be born when it's snow on the ground in Maine, and not like in July when there's not enough time to really get big enough to survive the winter. So very critical for a lot of animals to be able to synchronize this. Birds too, they start singing, making nests in order to have their eggs laid so that they can hatch during good conditions. Humans, I mean, we have this, it's called a circadian rhythm. What is your sleep-wake cycle? But our reproduction is not tied to that at all. So this biological clock, do you guys think you have one? I mean, what if they do these experiments? They put a person in a cave with no watches. Your internet is regulated, so there's no way to find out what time it is. When would you go to bed? When would you wake up? Now you kind of get sleepy, who knows when you guys get sleepy, but you wake up, generally the same time. But what if you didn't have any cues from the environment? Well, if you look at this experiment with flying squirrels, which are active nocturnally during the night, right? And you look at this first graph, you can see, they put them in a cage and they had a treadmill. And this one, they had a normal, lights came on during the day, off during the night. And you can see they're pretty good. They wake up in the night and they're active. There's a little bit of sloppiness there. But then they put them in a closet with constant darkness. And you can see in the beginning of the experiment, they still were active when it was supposed to be night, right? But look, over time, it really breaks down, doesn't it? And we see that with humans too, that we need that light clues in order to cue us in to when the day and night should be. So sure, we have a period that we sleep during the nighttime, and then without any clues of what time it is, that tends to shift and tends to break apart. But when we have light in the morning and darkness at night, it kind of resets that clock. So that's kind of our overall circadian rhythm. And this pineal gland measures day length, and it releases a hormone called melatonin. You've heard of it probably for sleep purposes or jet lag medication. But melatonin will vary depending on day lengths. And that tells a lot of animals, when to breed. All right, pineal gland. We'll talk more about it. All right, so again, the thalamus is going to be in that diencephalon, most of that region there. It's going to take your senses and it's going to edit them and decide what the cerebrum can be made aware of. And then the hypothalamus, again, lots of things with our hormones, and like I say, our thermostat is in there, and our thirst, our hunger, our other drives. So there's that third ventricle. You can see it rotating in the middle, has a hole in it, which is really a bar. It's actually solid because the rest of it is space. Yeah, right there. So look in there, you can see that's the diencephalon area right there. All right, just take a look underneath. Your eyes have huge optic nerves that carry all your visual information. You can see how they cross that optic chiasma. And so it goes to your occipital region is where you interpret vision, way back here. And so there's tracks that take it back there. And we'll talk more about it, but the whole signal is upside down, actually split in half. And half goes one way, half goes to the other. Take a look where they cross. Half stays on that side and half crosses. And so your mind puts everything upside down, puts it together, and you see what you see. But the raw data that reaches your brain is in half and upside down. It's just amazing how we put that together. So that's the information going. And you can see it passes through this midbrain region where there's some reflexes and such, but it's going to reach back here eventually, all that info from your retinas. All right, pituitary gland. Again, we start next semester with this, but for now, I want you to know that there's two lobes to it, an anterior and posterior lobes. And that posterior lobe is really an extension of the brain. It comes down. The anterior lobe is an extension of the roof of your mouth, but they come together as this one gland that sits in your sella turcica, sphenoid bone. And this gland has a dozen hormones that come out of it, all kinds of hormones. But no, the posterior pituitary comes, a stalk of the hypothalamus comes down, and it's an extension of your brain. Mammillary bodies I won't talk much about. They look like two breasts to some Greeks, whatever. The two little round bumps right there, and they're used in memory. Things go through your memory. They switch through there, but they're two obvious little bumps, like right next to that optic chiasma, right behind it. All right, I'm going to talk about two systems here. The reticular system is how awake you are, but now the limbic system. And some authors even identify a limbic lobe, but it's several parts of your brain. There's not like one part, but it's part. You can see the frontal, temporal lobe. It's kind of on the sides of the thalamus. And hey, come on in. I'm going to be talking. You keep going. Yeah. And but all these things is going to affect. It's going to be both your sense of smell and your emotion. So it's really what it does is everything you do is going to be control whether if you have pleasant experiences or unpleasant experiences. Really what controls you is those two things. You try to do more things that give you pleasant experiences and avoid the things that are unpleasant. That's the bottom line of life right there. But your limbic system, you'll see a sense of smell also is very cued into your emotions, because you will have a smell like grandma's house or fresh cut grass, something like that, and it will bring back all these emotions even before you identify the smell. So the other senses, vision and hearing, we're going to see they switch a little differently in your brain, but the limbic system takes that olfactory smell information and it assigns emotion to it right away. All right, the brain stem. This is really holds, the cerebrum is going to be a lot of your higher thought, your decision making, your memory. When you get down to the brain stem, we're talking about some functions that are just basic to life, like your heart rate and breathing. These centers are all housed here. Things like basic as vomiting and coughing and sneezing. These are things that if your cerebrum was impaired, you'd be unconscious, you would lose memory function. But when your brainstem becomes impaired, this causes death, because these are some of the the basic functions of life are held there. So brainstem itself, we'll see the midbrain is really not that interesting, and then the pons and medulla make up the brainstem. Yeah, and here you can see an illustration of that. And we'll get to each of these, and you can see that cerebral aqueduct goes through the midbrain to connect that third and fourth ventricle. So the fluid, cerebrospinal fluid will be flowing through there. And then your medulla oblongata turns into your spinal cord as it exits that foramen magnum. There's no specific spot where things really change. It's kind of a continuation there. And the gray matter will go from the outside to the inside through your brainstem. So it makes that butterfly in the spinal cord. So all that happens there as the medulla turns into the spinal cord. All right, midbrain. So remember in embryonic development, it's the midbrain. And so it really does, it changes the least compared to the forebrain and the hindbrain. So through it runs the cerebral aqueduct, and on the back, there's going to be these 4 bumps that varies looking at humans to birds, things like that, which ones are bigger, but it's going to be, I'll show you reflex centers for vision and auditory. And of course, remember all the wiring that's going to go from your cerebrum down and from your spinal cord up are going to run through that midbrain too. So there's going to be places for reflexes, and yeah. Take a little picture here. You can see midbrain. Yeah, I'll see where that is. So small little piece, and it has that obvious aqueduct there connecting the 2 ventricles. All right, here's a view in the back. And we'll see if we see a sheep brain or not this semester. But if you look at the back of the midbrain, it has these 4 bumps. And it's called the Corpora quadrigemina. So corpora means body, corpus Christi, and then quadrigemina, Gemini are twins. So there's 4 little bumps back there. And the upper ones, called superior colliculi, will be for reflexes for vision. So as your eyes move to follow something, and the inferior colliculi are for hearing reflexes. You hear a loud sound, you turn your head in order to better be able to localize that sound. Yeah. All right, in front of the medulla is a swelling, well, I should say superior to it is a swelling that actually has the whole width of this area is the pons. And the pons, again, in this class, we can't get into all the details of everything that happens, so we just kind of cover it briefly. But within it, when we get to breathing, we'll talk about how the centers for breathing will be in the medulla and pons, and they kind of feed off each other. Yeah, so it's this bulging area in front anteriorly. And lastly, the last part of the brainstem before you get to the spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. If you recognize that movie above there, Waterboy, yep. This, of course, the most basic part of your brain, the deepest part of your brain has those centers for respiratory, for cardiac function, for looking what to do about blood pressure, all these things. And a lot of basic reflexes are held in there too. And of course, all this brainstem, you got to have the ascending and descending tracts carrying the information up and down. All right, here's a view. Again, look at the human brain. It's just this lump of fatty tissue when it's not alive, and when it is functioning and has glucose and oxygen, electrical activity, has all this amazing capabilities, right? Well, look back here. The cerebrum is the biggest part of the human brain. The cerebellum is a little cerebrum down below. So let's talk about that. And just show you an MRI here of someone with a cerebellar issue. So the cerebellum, a large part of your brain down there. Remember, it's under that tent-like structure between the occipital lobe and the cerebellum. And generally, if I have to describe the cerebellum, it's going to be important for coordination and motor issues. So your cerebrum will tell you, how to do this athletic activity, this gymnastic activity, and you need the software in there to figure out how to do that activity without having to. Cerebrum doesn't want to understand every single movement of every muscle, flexion and relaxation of each muscle, but your cerebellum will take motor functions and smooth things out and remember what you want to do when you want to do something. So learning, remembering motor skills, yeah. And if you look at it, it's beautiful, cut in half. Hopefully you get to see that and see in there, you see this kind of arbor vitae, this tree of life in there. And lots of surface area there, so a lot going on. You can see the cortex on the outside, kind of gray, and the white matter on the inside makes that kind of nice tree. And yeah, not only I talk about athletics, but just your posture and all your movements. Without a cerebellum, you have some real issues doing that kind of stuff smoothly. It's got a right and left hemisphere. It's connected by this worm-like region called the vermis. And of course, it has to be connected to the brainstem. It has these called peduncles, or these connections, 3 connections that come down. See you, Dave. Yep. Here's another view. Beautiful. Looking at the inside of a fresh cerebellum. You can see that kind of tree in there. Oh, gorgeous. So it's a big part of your brain stuck back there, right? All right. I'm kind of going through the anatomy. Hopefully you guys will take a look at the book, look at your figures. The Kerr cloud goes through each area of the brain. Yeah. So the reticular formation is going to be your wakefulness, okay? So you guys know when you sleep, you are not aware of everything. Like you have people whispering, like how do you not notice that, right? But yet the fire alarm goes off, you hear it, right? And so the reticular formation, what's really important, a big thing about your brain is that it can't possibly deal with all the stimulus around you. You would go crazy. So reticular formation is a filter of what gets through. And during sleep, the filter is set at a certain level where only a loud alarm or a real noxious smell or something like that, or pain, someone pinches you, that causes you, the reticular formation, to wake up your cerebrum. And so it kind of puts it in a snooze or a sleep mode in your computer. And so the reticular formation is really part of that. And it filters what gets through and how awake, or how, not really awake, I guess, how wakefulness, or how aware you are. You get some caffeine in you and it makes you more aware of your surroundings, your cerebrum better able to think. It's what it's about, your reticular formation. And again, this is not seated in one particular place. You can see from your hypothalamus, your cerebellum, and cerebrum, many places. So the limbic system and this reticular formation, we can't point to one spot, but it's several areas in the brain. So you should know it more as functionally what it does. It's going to be what filters what gets to your cerebrum, which is what you're conscious of, what you can perceive. Yeah, you're in a coma, your reticular formation is not letting anything through, right? There's even cut someone, they don't even, are not even aware of it. All right, well, a couple more topics. And again, we just touched the surface of all these things, but I do want you to know the sleep and why do we sleep? It's so fascinating. You think about why we spend half our lives not mating or eating, or we're kind of just sitting there asleep, right? And it is we don't really completely understand the sleep. Some people think it's a time when we filter short-term to long-term memory and dreaming, and what's the function of dreaming, and so much to talk about. But what basically the nuts and bolts, I want you to know, you have the deep sleep, and then your REM sleep, or REM and non-REM. And that means rapid eye movement, or paradoxical sleep, because essentially you see like your dog, it's sleeping and all of a sudden you'll see its eyes move and its legs jerking, and sometimes lets out a little yelp. And so we go through this periods of REM sleep where we come up, our heart rate and our respiratory rate comes up, and our brain is quite active even though we're asleep. And then the deep sleep, the very restful sleep, is when we're not doing that. And actually your temperature lowers just a little bit, and heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down. And we have this alternating REM and non-REM sleep, and you need both to get a good night's sleep. Yeah, if you take a look as you go through the night, you can look at this younger graph in the middle here, and you see periods where you go through REM sleep, not REM sleep, and you wake up. And look, as you get older, as you get elderly, your sleep is disrupted. And so you get a period of wakefulness right in the middle of the night. So grandpa always gets up super early and can't sleep as well during the night. And then that's what happens as you get older. And if you keep someone from having any of this going through this deep and REM sleep, you'll have sleep deprivation. You'll start showing serious effects, and you can die from not sleeping. It's a necessary thing. Your brain needs to go through that sleep, and both the REM and non-REM sleep to be healthy. Yeah. And sleep it's fascinating. I knew a guy who studied sleep, and he said, if you are woken up by your alarm, you're not getting enough sleep. You should naturally wake up. Your hormone levels change, your temperature goes up, and you should wake. I mean, how many of you, do that regularly? In college, you're chronically not sleeping enough, right? So I've done this briefly. I've gone through the different parts of the brain, and this is something for you guys to read, go through the lab. I certainly want to memorize the parts of the brain and what they do. I've given you little tidbits of each and the major functions of each. So take some notes. This is a nice table going through all of it. Yeah, and so brain waves, this is something you might study in psychology or neuropsychology, neurobiology, definitely. But we can study brain waves. I showed you the MRI, like functional MRI. We can look at what parts of the brain are active by what blood supply goes to where in the brain. And this is looking at actual electrical activity of the whole brain. And you don't have to memorize any of these. I just want you to know that we can do, it's called an EEG, an electroencephalogram. Cephalo is head, as opposed to an EKG, which is electrocardiogram with your heart. But we can do this, and we can measure brain waves that tell you, what's your periods of sleep and wakefulness. It's important legally too, looking at when death occurs. If you have no brain activity, um, you make sure there's some drugs that can cause this, make sure they're really dead and not just in a state. All right, and lastly, I'm going to end this lecture. I just have a couple more slides to talk about mental illness. And as I began this section, I talked about how important it is if we can map the brain and understand how the brain works better in order to tackle mental illness, because the toll on society. Out in this class, statistically, many of you suffer from depression or other mental illnesses. And think about the whole country, the whole world. If we could understand it better, not just manage some of these things, but get to the root cause of depression and other mental illnesses, it would alleviate so much, again, not just emotional, psychological toll and monetary toll of people being debilitated from mental illness, right? So just talk about, I think, depression, schizophrenia and depression. So I can't, in this class, we can't cover it all. But schizophrenia means kind of a split brain, and it's pretty rare. Usually occurs in your 20s, and the people, it's a serious mental disability. And hallucinations, where you see things or hear things that aren't actually there. And delusions is when your reality is warped, and you may be paranoid or think, hallucination, maybe you're hearing voices, and delusions, you're just sure that, could be that you're Superman, or that someone is the devil that you see, things like that. And then also when you see it it comes up in teens, that they will, and you can see some of this with drug use too. So you have to tease out what the issue is, but stop taking care of themselves and show symptoms where they just don't get pleasure out of things they used to, and real personality changes. So it could be schizophrenia, it could be drugs, it could be other things too, definitely. But there's some genetic predisposition when you look at that. It runs in families a little bit. But you can see 1% of the world population is this really debilitating place to be when you're schizophrenic, where sometimes you're detached from reality, and they can, no cure, but they can look at drugs and some other therapies to look at that. So schizophrenia. And then, of course, depression, very, very common. And you can be bipolar, is a type of depression where you go through real highs and lows, manic episodes where you talk a lot, you may do risky behaviors, all these things. And then depressive episodes where you don't want to get out of bed, you take no pleasure in anything, and you can go up and down from there. Yeah, and so again, it's brain chemistry, and so a lot of the therapies go towards drugs, drugs that we can affect your brain chemistry. And the idea is to get you feeling good. Good is just, and to tell person that's depressed, just snap out of it it just doesn't work, because those of you that are depressed know it's not that easy, right? You have feelings of hopelessness and feelings of, lack of motivation to do anything. And so, yeah. And so we have, first line to be getting exercise, changing your environment kind of thing. And then look to drugs that can try to stabilize your moods. But again, depression, very, very common issue. All right. So hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Kind of when I give it, I realize that we're just kind of going over everything at a certain level, right? There's so much, could go so much deeper. Oh my gosh, into mental illness, into the functions of the different parts of the brain. But I want you guys to come away knowing the basic brain anatomy and what basically the major functions of the different areas from this lecture. All right, I'm going to end it now. Our last section, we'll get into the nerves, the autonomic nervous system in your brain, and we'll finish this big chunk that is the important nervous system. All right.